By now, we've come to understand that whenever Ciri dreams or prophesizes things, they come true. So we can assume that what we see next is actually going to happen. Ciri sees Codringer and Fen. They're discussing old legends and prophecies. One's related to Princess Cirilla, daughter of the Elder Blood, great 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 granddaughter of Falca, and eventual mother of an Avenger who will destroy the old world and build a new one from the ruins. This is a really interesting prophecy because it actually will take place after the events of the third Witcher game, which is the one place in the timeline that really hasn't been covered yet, for obvious reasons. During their chatter, there's a knock at their door. Codringer opens their door and finds a half-elf and two humans standing before him. The elf informs him that Rient sends his regards, and they stab Codringer to death. They enter the building, and they kick Fen out of his wheelchair. They don't really say anything, but they take several documents from the two, and they set the entire building ablaze, with the dying Fen and Codringer still inside. Ciri awoke soaked in sweat. She sensed something was wrong, so she quickly got dressed, and almost as if prompted, Yennefer came in to see her and told her to follow her, and she obeyed. It was still the night of the banquet when Geralt woke. Yennefer was still asleep, but he needed to relieve himself. While he was in the corridor, he heard a faint scream. Geralt, being the way he is, ran toward the screams. Upon his entry of the chamber, he is detained by two very large men, and he sees Artaud Terranova being detained by Dijkstra and his men. Also present was Keira Mentz. She places handcuffs on Terranova and has Dijkstra remove Geralt from the area. Geralt uses this opportunity to inquire with Dijkstra as to what was going on, and though the mages were united under the circle, there was division beneath the surface. At one side were the mages loyal to their kings and homelands in the north. This included Philippa, Triss, Keira, Sabrina, and also Marty Sodergren and Dora Gary, two that Geralt met during the banquet. The other side were those who were allied themselves with Nilfgaard, and this side included Artaud Terranova, that name I told you I wasn't going to try to pronounce this one, Francesca Findabar, and their leader, Vilgefortz. They were promised rule over the provinces of the conquered kingdoms. Really, this was just Emperor Mir being a tactical genius and weakening the north by creating turmoil amongst the mages, essentially removing them from the game board. This was the Mage Rebellion that takes place during the Second Great War. I refer to it in my video about the Great Wars, but just to keep it simple, there are three major wars with Nilfgaard, and this is what starts the events of the second one. I also thought it was worth mentioning that all of this is happening around the same time that the Thronebreaker story is taking place. At this time, Geralt sees the castle absolutely littered with Redanians. They enter a chamber inhabited by Sabrina, Keira, and Triss, hovering over the dead body of Vilgefortz's assistant, Lydia. She attacked them, and they were forced to defend themselves. Upon the realization that Geralt entered the room, Triss approached Geralt and cast a spell that blinded his vision. She does this in an effort to protect him, keeping him ignorant of events that he would otherwise see. He hears Philippa's voice enter the fray. She is the one who is leading this coup. He hears her bark orders to a whole bunch of the other mages in the room, and tells Dijkstra to take Geralt to his ship in the harbor. Philippa restores Geralt's vision, and Dijkstra and his men begin escorting him. Dijkstra, his men, and Geralt stop at a fountain. Dijkstra tries to make Geralt understand the situation, and tries to make him go aboard his ship and join him in Tredegor. He confesses to Geralt that he needs him. He needs him to give Ciri to King Vizimir, something that Geralt, as you can imagine, isn't completely on board with. So Geralt, being the gentleman that he is, politely refuses Dijkstra. No, not really. He single-handedly beats the stuffing out of Dijkstra and his men and snaps Dijkstra's legs so that he can't be followed. Dandelion approaches almost as if prompted, and he tells Geralt that Ciri is gone. This comes as no surprise to Geralt, and he asks if Dandelion had brought his sword like he discussed. He had, and Geralt makes his way back to Artuza to save Yennefer and Ciri. He makes it back to the chamber where he had spent the night with Yennefer. She was not there, and just a black dress was on the floor, which leaves Geralt the task to search the entire castle for the two of them. Geralt finds Marty Sodergren, along with the body of that name again, making this the second death for the Nilfgaardian allied mages, the first being Lydia, Vilgefortz's assistant. And from there, Geralt makes his way to Garstang, and he's confronted by Doragary, who is running in the opposite direction of the trail that Geralt was on. He tells Geralt treachery has happened, and he is immediately shot in the back with an arrow. Two Scoia'tael stood behind him, and Geralt faced them down. He deflects an arrow shot at him, and is charged by the other. He makes quick work of him, and before he has time to vanquish the other, he bursts into flame from another sorcerer, who then began shooting spells at Geralt, but Geralt identified him and the mage stopped. The two carried Doragary to a safer location across a bridge. Upon their arrival there, Marty Sodergren had caught up to Geralt and began helping Doragary. The sorcerer was introduced as Carduin, who informed them all about the situation in Garstang. Philippa had tried to detain Vilgefortz, and Francesca brought Scoia'tael, and the two sides were engaged in all-out combat. And just in case I'm not being clear, the mages were divided, and there were Scoia'tael, and it wasn't just 4 or 5 people fighting, it was somewhat of an all-out war between the two sides. Geralt departs the group and continues to the tower. During Geralt's ascent, he's blindsided by Kira, who falls on him, sending the two falling to the ground. Kira informs Geralt that Terra Nova had thrown her from a window, and as you can imagine, she was in pretty bad shape. Broken leg, broken teeth, bloody, even had a broken rib or two. She asks Geralt to carry her up to the mountain while she guards him with magic. They don't make it very far though, because Geralt has to put her down due to the blood and the pain, and she then tells Geralt more information about the coup. Francesca had Scoia'tael hidden beneath Garstang, and those who now pledged loyalty to Nilfgaard had planned to take over the very next morning. Philippa's decision to arrest Vilgefortz just hastened their actions. And then, unfortunately, Geralt has to leave her there. And as I'm sure you know, it won't be the last time that Geralt runs into her. We transition to Ciri, who is completely surrounded by smoke, fire, explosions, and chaos. She was coming out of one of her paranormal out-of-mind episodes and was oblivious to what was going on. Yennefer was at her side, and she takes Ciri by the hand and leads her down a smoke-filled corridor and tells her that she must stay, but Ciri has to get on a horse and run. She tells her that she must flee to Loxia and find Margarita. She resists, but eventually she complies, and even though Yennefer is usually quite cold, kind of like Geralt, her last words to Ciri were, "I love you, my daughter." She begins her escape, but it turns out to be much more difficult than just finding a horse and going. Scoia'tael had spotted her and chased her through the corridors. She makes it to a ledge towering over a courtyard, with a small footbridge 10 feet below. She's able to slip her pursuers using her superior agility and nimble acrobatic skills. Reince was standing in the courtyard below where Ciri was, and he insisted that her elven pursuers chase after her, even though that it was nearly suicidal given the kind of acts that she was performing. She finally slips the elves, but unfortunately it's only the beginning of her perils. She would make it to a cloister before being grabbed by Artaud Terra Nova. She heavily struggles, but she tires herself out and gets nowhere. He talks himself through scenarios in which he would personally take the cub to Emperor Emhyr and the potential reward for finding her. However, during his excitement, an owl noiselessly descended and relieved Terra Nova of his lustful eyes. A single scream echoed in the chamber, and his pain was momentary before a Witchered steel cut through the air, relieving him of his pain. His body collapsed, and Ciri cried out in excitement to see Geralt behind the fallen sorcerer. Geralt gives Ciri her sword and tells her that she has to keep going to the stable, and that he will be right behind her. It isn't quite the reunion that she was hoping for, but she does as he says, and she keeps going, and makes it to the stable and rides off. She looks over her shoulder and sees a single assailant pursuing her, a knight in black armor with wings on his helmet. In a blind panic, she accidentally corners herself in a courtyard. She draws her sword in anticipation of her nightmarish pursuer. He catches up to her, He dismounts and he advances towards her, giving her a paralyzing fear from her childhood trauma. She screams out to him that he will not touch her, but he knows that he has to. As he reaches out for her, her instincts and muscle memory from Kaer Morhen take over. To the Nilfgaardian's dismay, and his best attempts to grab her, she parries, pirouettes, and slashes away. Her paralyzing fear was suddenly replaced with fury, to the point that he's left bleeding, beaten, and helmetless on his knees at her mercy. And she had every intention of killing him where he knelt. But something happened to her. Upon looking in the eyes of the now helmetless Nilfgaardian, all of the rage, the pain, and the trauma went away. Underneath that dreaded winged helmet was a monster. It was just a man. And Ciri left him where he knelt. Fast forward a short amount of time into the future, and several Scoia'tael come to find their Nilfgaardian ally. He was alone, and he was badly injured. They try to help him to his feet, and as he tells them to go after the girl, steel rained from above, killing the Scoia'tael. The Nilfgaardian was injured, so he could do nothing. He was helpless, and he watched the Scoia'tael be cut down by the fierce white wolf. Eventually, the only remaining noise was the water fountain in the courtyard, now overflowing and turned red from Geralt's slaughter of the elves. He felt Geralt's blade, and he asked Geralt for mercy. And Geralt asked him for one good reason, to which he replied, "It was I who got her out of Cintra." He opens his eyes, and Geralt is gone. But before he can be too relieved, he passes out from blood loss. Geralt eventually arrives at a tower in which he knew Ciri was hiding at. But before he can go in and get her, he had one more problem to deal with. Vilgefortz was standing between him and the tower, and he had every intention of taking her. Vilgefortz tried talking to Geralt. Much like everyone else before him, he tried to get Geralt to side with him, and he said he had no intention of hurting Ciri. But as you can imagine, Geralt has had enough talking at this point. He denied the offer, and he knew he would have to fight. But this fight is drastically different than past ones. If you're like me, you see Geralt as somewhat of an invincible hero. There's really not many times that I know of that I've ever heard of Geralt getting beaten in a fight, least of all as badly as Vilgefortz beats him. Vilgefortz uses his magic to evade, elude, and counter all of Geralt's strikes with inhuman speeds. Geralt's astonishment is short-lived, however. Once his guard is finally broken, Vilgefortz strikes Geralt with his staff, to the belly, ribs, head, and to his leg. The last thing Geralt remembers is the blow that shatters his femur, and then he slips out of consciousness. Before he does, however, he hears Vilgefortz tell him that he doesn't want to kill him, and that he planned on using this beating as a lesson, or a teaching. It's Triss who finds Geralt. She drags him to Tissaia, who is fighting off Nilfgaardians and Scoia'tael. She tells Triss to leave, to teleport away, as all the other mages had. Triss pleads her for the help to teleport her and Geralt away, and she does. We end the chapter of the book, and Geralt is fighting off death. To the southwest of Temeria lies a land that no human dare venture, a forest so dangerous that bandits, merchants, and any army doesn't go near it. The Forest of Death itself, Brokilon. Despite the tension and the fear that was overwhelming Dandelion, he was determined to do his mission. He makes it to a clearing near the forest edge. He pulls out his lute, and he begins to play. He wanted to seem as harmless as possible for his potentially hostile hosts. His strategy worked quite well. Amidst his song, he notices a feminine voice join in his ballad. Despite his attempts to continue singing, his fear causes his voice to stop working. He turns to see a female dryad and tells her that he is a friend of the Witcher Geralt of Rivia, and she vanishes into the woods. Just as Dandelion was about to crack from fear, he hears a rustle in the bushes, and Geralt steps forward. And considering the fact that he was walking around, we can assume that several weeks have passed since Vilgefortz beat Geralt nearly to death. He was evidently been recovering from his wounds in the care of the dryads and elves in the forest. The two sit together in the dark forest in the company of the dryads, and Geralt wishes for Dandelion to tell him everything that has been going on in the world. Now, the rest of this chapter is in first-person perspective of the people involved in the events, so to keep things simple, I'm going to go through everything without jumping back and forth. Just know everything I say is being told to Geralt from Dandelion, or happening in between his stories. So first, just so you have a foothold, this is the beginning of the Second Great War, which I've mentioned before. Nilfgaard invades Lyria and Edirn with serious ferocity. I did a video about the Great War, and I'll plug it in the description just in case you want to see it, or you can play Thronebreaker. King Foltest signs a treaty with Nilfgaard, though we know that Emperor Emhyr will eventually betray this treaty. And for those of you who have already played Thronebreaker, there is the telling of the events that leads to the execution of Black Rayla. Basically, her and her unit were escorting refugees out of Edirn, and her unit stays back to delay the Scoia'tael pursuers from killing their people. Unfortunately, every member of her unit is killed, and Rayla, being the sole survivor, is to be executed, which is when you discover her in Thronebreaker, at which point her fate is up to you. The next scene that we see is soldiers in Kaedwen, and they have been given orders to march to their southern border and give protection to the people of Upper Edirn. Next, we get a small look at Francesca Findabair, who we now realize betrayed the Circle so that her and her people could have their own country to which she was now queen. The land was located north of Lyria, and was called Dol Blathanna. The only condition she had to meet is that they are not to help the Scoia'tael anymore, a term that she had no issues fulfilling. Tissaia was having difficulty coping with the fact that her brothers and sisters of the Circle were killing each other. As such, we join her as she is writing down something unknown to us at the time. She then sits down at the desk, and she takes her own life. Amidst all of Dandelion's storytelling, he falls asleep, and once he wakes up, he catches up to Geralt, who is preparing to depart Brokilon. He felt guilty. He had not told Geralt rumors being spread regarding Ciri and Yennefer's fates. Geralt tells him he can tell him on the way. He saddles up and the two depart Brokilon. And strangely enough, this is the last we'll see of either of them for the rest of this novel. Before the end of the chapter, we have one more story that transpires, and it occurs to the far south, in Nilfgaard, the royal palace of Loch Grim, to be exact. The throne room was absolutely overrun with subjects of the Empire. Chatter filled the chamber with talk of the capture of an orphaned pup who was heir to the throne in Cintra. Emperor Emhyr took his place at his throne, and his knights escorted the young queen to the throne, and the crowd froze in anticipation. Emhyr, to the dismay of many, treated the queen with a great deal of respect, and almost seemed pleased to meet her. He tells her while the rulers of the north would see her dead, he wished for the two of them to be allies, and that she could wait out the war away from the north under his protection, and when it's over, she can return to her land and her throne. Once the audience and the queen cleared out, their emperor remained at his throne and beckoned his advisors. He gives each of them a very specific task, and it's another instance of him revealing his tactical mind yet again. He sends for a mage by the name of Xarthisius, and tasks him to track down an individual using the person's DNA, though it doesn't tell us who exactly he's looking for, but Emhyr suspects that the individual in the company of Vilgefortz, who has disappeared since the night of the rebellion, Rience, has also vanished, and he assigns another of his advisors to be prepared to take Vilgefortz. The advisor that he tasks this to is named Stefan Skellen. His task was to kill Vilgefortz and also kill Rience, because the two had failed to bring him Ciri, but whoever this third person was, they were to be kept alive. Before the chapter's end, he had one final inquiry to cover. He wanted to know who had brought the young queen to his empire. He was told that she was brought by a half-elf and a human. This intrigued the emperor for one simple reason. The pup that was brought before him earlier that day, the child all of Nilfgaard now believes to be under the country's care, and rightful ruler of Cintra, was not the real Ciri. He knew this the moment he saw her, but he had plans to which the real Ciri wasn't even necessary. Ciri opened her eyes. Next to her was a bloody rock and a bloody gash on her temple. She was in the middle of a desert, with nothing around her but a sea of sand, some rocks, and some twigs. She was beaten up and bruised, but nothing broken, she discovered. For a good while, the heat kept her from doing anything productive, so she reflected on her situation. Hidden in the tower where Geralt thought that Ciri cornered herself, she found a portal to which none of the mages in Artusa knew where it went. But she took her chances in an effort to get away from Vilgefortz, which, as we saw from the fight with Geralt, turned out to be the right decision. Despite the unbearable pain in her head and, well, the rest of her body, she knew that she would need to find water, or that she would die. She musters what strength she can, stands up, and sets off in the direction of the setting sun. Once night fell, the scorching heat was replaced with a biting cold that made even moving itself difficult. Just as feeling of hopelessness nearly cripples her, she has an epiphany. She spent so much time reminding herself she's a witcher that she forgot to remind herself that she was also an enchantress. Though she didn't know any spells to keep her warm or conjure water, she knew how to relax her muscles and create a ball of light to help her see. It took her several tries and a lot of focus until she finally pulled the spells off. And just as her situation shows a glimmer of hope, the sun begins to rise in front of her. She had gotten turned around at some point in the night. Before allowing herself to despair, she turns around and she goes the other way. However, night falls again, and she feels too weak to cast her spells. Something, however, catches her eye. A personal item she had dropped at the start of her journey. She, at this point, is plagued with despair. She was right back where she had started. Now, I know I'm kind of flying through this, but Ciri spends a long time in this desert. The author does a really great job at creating tension for a character that we know is going to live for at least another 15 years. And there are more than a few times when you feel for this poor girl who's stuck in a desert. Despite her desire to give up, she got up and pressed on. Occasionally, she would find these lizard nests with eggs in them, which she would eat raw for nutrition. And at night, she would allow condensation to build up on her dagger that she had and lick it off for water, as well as finding small amounts in hollows and crevices beneath rocks. So she was keeping herself alive, but just barely. Fighting through muscle failure, exhaustion, and severe dehydration, starvation, she eventually reaches her breaking point, as any human would. Days of wandering and not enough nutrition, she lied in the sand, awaiting her time to pass, which at this point she kind of welcomed because she was pretty miserable. While she's lying there, something nudges her. In shock, she musters the strength to sit up. There was a horse idly looking at her, and as if it wasn't hard enough to believe, this wasn't just any ordinary horse. From the center of its forehead, a single horn protruded. Now, Ciri immediately faints when she notices this, because unicorns aren't even real in this world. There's no mention of them in Witcher tales or any historical records. Once she regains consciousness, her horned mythical companion is still with her, with dripping wet hooves. Seeing this, she musters the strength to follow him, and he shows her how to find water. The horse took her to a very small ravine with some rocks in it. He pressed down several times with his hooves, and she understood. She began to dig, and she eventually got deep enough that water seeped into the hole. Not a lot, and it was muddy and sandy, but it was still water. She gets the notion that Little Horse, which she calls him, wants to lead her somewhere. The two become traveling companions. The two could eat ants together, and the unicorn would find lizard nests for Ciri, and she would use a cloth she had to strain the sand from watering holes. It still wasn't optimal survival, but they were doing better as a team than they would have by themselves. The only catch to traveling with the unicorn was, even though they could probably save time, the unicorn would not let Ciri ride him, or even touch him for that matter. When he slept, he was standing up, so she couldn't even sleep on him in the nights. Eventually, Little Horse neighs in excitement and leads Ciri to a large egg-shaped hole in the sand. The two revel in brief excitement, hoping to find a vast portion of water inside of the hole. But it wasn't until the two of them were sliding downward helplessly into the pit that Ciri realized the danger that they were in. She notices something moving at the bottom of the pit, beneath the sand. Two pincers emerged from the sand and began to thrash at the desperately struggling unicorn. Siri charges the creature with what little strength she has and desperately tries to stab the creature, but to no effect. It's burrowed itself far too deep in the sand. Luckily, she has an episode of quick thinking, and a spell she knows comes to her, and she shoots a blast of telekinetic energy at the ground, exposing the repulsive creature. In a blind panic, the creature abandons his offensive attack and tries to bury itself again, desperately pouring sand on it. But Siri and Little Horse quickly take the initiative and stab the beast several times and eventually kill it. But not hastily enough, unfortunately. The creature wounded the unicorn's leg, and he was bleeding profusely. Once they get out of the pit, Siri attempts to examine the unicorn's wounds, but he still refused to allow her to touch him. So they press on towards a mountain range in the far distance. They see several more holes in the ground on the way, and they avoid them like the plague. Some of them were even larger than the one that they had encountered. Eventually, Little Horse collapses, and he doesn't have the strength to withdraw from Siri's attempts to look at his wounds, and Siri quickly realizes that his wounds are infected, and the creature beneath the sand had poisonous pincers. Now, in my Blood of Elves video, I describe magic as an individual's ability to tap into the energy of any life force and manipulate it to their bidding. Siri wanted to heal her horned companion, but she was unable to find any source, be it water, fire, or anything. And at that moment, she gets an idea. She gathers some of the dried and dead vegetation and sets it ablaze with a spell, but has a thought before drawing from it. During her lessons, Yennefer told Siri that you should never use fire to draw power, but she was desperate. And in case you're wondering, the only reason why she didn't do this to build a fire to keep herself warm was because now they were close enough to the mountain range that there was actually some vegetation. Almost immediately, she feels an overwhelming sense of power, more than she can handle, in fact. She lifted off the ground and began hearing voices and seeing things. A black-haired woman telling her how powerful she was, and that everyone she knew and loved abandoned her, and they all deserved to die, trying to fill her with rage and fury. She manages to heal the unicorn, but the fire shooting out of her causes him to flee. She sees a vision of the deaths of everyone she knows and loves, but once she sees Geralt, and she wants to let the vision know that she won't be controlled anymore. To be a little more clear, almost as if the fire was an entity itself, it was trying to fill her with hate and rage and anger, but she completely refused it. The backlash of refusing essentially purges all magic from her body, and she falls on her back, filled with anguish and yet emptiness. She lied there, feeling overwhelmed with apathy. Completely nothingness. She felt nothing. No thirst, heat, pain, hope, exhaustion, or even fear of death. As such, the clatter of a company of horses who try to help her are completely ignored. She's thrown on a horse of a Nilfgaardian knight, but any fear or anger are totally absent. The unicorn Little Horse was nowhere to be found, but Ciri was out of the desert. Over the next several days, the gravity of Ciri's situation becomes clear. She had fallen into Nilfgaardian hands. A single knight by the name of Swears was leading a band of trappers and were fully aware of who they had found in the desert. It turns out, she was in the Karath Desert, to the east of Nilfgaard. Her abductors, as you can imagine, were very horrible and wicked men. They beat her, kicked her, they were just completely terrible to her. Company runs into two knights, who, according to the trappers, are a rival family of the Swears, and things get pretty ugly, as I'm sure you can imagine. Swears ends up engaging the knights in combat, and he wins the fight, but he ends up pretty gravely wounded. The trappers leave him behind and carry on to a settlement nearby. The trappers arrive at an inn, and they run into some acquaintances of theirs, and they weren't alone. They had a captive of their own, a quote-unquote rat-looking man bound to a post in the tavern. The trappers recognize him immediately. They tie Ciri to a post near him and join their fellow scumbags for food and drink. Ciri and the rat-faced man briefly interact. Apparently, the man's name is Kale, and he was the leader of a gang called the Rats. The two didn't talk very much, but Ciri manages to quietly convince the innkeeper to smuggle a knife to her. He didn't need much convincing upon hearing the trapper's plans to rape. Just as she frees Kayle from his binds, a tree chunk comes flying through the window, followed by a fair-haired woman, who says nothing, but begins killing the trappers. A young man follows her through the window, then the front door is kicked in and 2 more people enter the inn. It's at this point the men realize the mistake of capturing a member of the Rat Gang. The 6-strong gang killed everyone in the inn, aside from Ciri, who, during the scrap, managed to impress a few of the rats with her agility and form. However, they had no time to chat, and they offer Ciri a horse, and the 7 try to make their escape from the village. During their escape, Ciri has a pretty life-changing event. A man charges her with a lance, and Ciri kills him, an experience she doesn't like, by the way. But it is her first, and it goes into extremely detailed moments where she knows that she'll recall this for the rest of her life. Eventually, the gang makes it back to one of their hideouts, and we learn all about the rats. Now, we get a real good amount of detail about who each member of the gang is, but this video is going to be long enough, so I'm going to do it in a separate video following this one. But to summarize, the horrible world they live in created 6 mismatched outcasts, orphans, and vigilantes who killed, robbed, and tormented the wicked of their territory. And Ciri was now one of them. She gave herself a name, Falca, the 7th member of the Rats. She was finally able to feel safe again. The final setting is in the court of the prefect, joined by Ymir's emissary, Stefan Skellen, and he gives the prefect one very simple task: to kill the rats. All of them. Even though the prefect had heard rumors of the 7th member of the gang, and he suspected it to be Ciri, but Stefan told him to kill them anyways, and that he was to continue searching for the girl. Alright, that's it for the Time of Contempt. If you have any questions, and if you think I've glossed over something that might be too important, feel free to use the comments so that we can plug up any holes. But anyway, thank you for watching, and take care.